Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS instructor, also Director of Intelligence at Red Canary, Senior Non-Resident Fellow for the Atlantic Council, and we have lots to talk about this month as always. So welcome. So glad you all could join us. If you hit us up in the comments, I'd love to hear where in the world you are dialing in from. Always love to hear if there are things on your mind, if there are questions you have, threats you're tracking, right? The goal of this live stream is to just share what threats are happening, what things you should be paying attention to, what actions you should take. This threat landscape is overwhelming, and the goal is to kind of wade through it together. So let's kick things right off today. I debated where to start, and we're going to start with Ukraine. I don't know if we have anyone listening from Ukraine. If so, we're thinking of you. Obviously, the tensions in Ukraine have gotten to a peak, perhaps. I was just checking, like right now on the news, seeing what's the latest. Right, Russia is saying it pulled back some troops. Ukraine and West want proof. Suffice it to say, tensions in Ukraine are high. And as threat analysts, we have to know what's happening in the world. Absolutely, right? Last month, we had John Holtquist come in and talk to us, and right, that was back in January, and tensions are still high. This is something that I'm watching. A lot of analysts in this community are watching really carefully, as we should be. But I don't know about anyone else. I'd love to hear what others are doing or thinking right now, but I personally feel a little bit of a sense of frustration because, right, heightened geopolitical tensions, but it's tough to know what to do. Right. As cybersecurity professionals, I think the best thing we can do right now is prepare, think about our threat models. Again, I had John Holtquist on last month and highlighted this awesome kind of proactive preparation, hardening for destructive attacks that Mandiant put out. And I think one of the toughest things in a time like this where you're like, hey, is there going to be a massive outbreak of activity in cyberspace, right? That kind of mirrors any kind of kinetic invasion. If that happens, it's a lot of unknown. And I know a lot of people out there, including myself, are feeling this like tension of like, we don't know what's going to happen. And it sounds boring, but I really think the best thing that organizations can do right now is think about preparation. It's boring, but do you have an incident response playbook, right? Brush that thing off. Check it out, right? So very potentially a little bit boring, but important as well. We got some folks in Poland, for example, right? So folks asking, should we be looking out for when servers and communications go down in the border? Could that be a good indication of progression? Absolutely. I think that's a great comment. And I think the positive of maybe the situation in Ukraine is that there are defenders, right, across the world who are watching infrastructure. The Ukrainian CERT, they've published great stuff over the past few weeks. And so, I think what a lot of us are looking out for is intelligence preparation of the battlefield. We certainly saw things we highlighted last month, some potential ghostwriter related activity, things John Holtquist highlighted. But I think we're all kind of looking for what are the signs, potentially that Russian actors or other actors have moved past the intelligence preparation of the battlefield towards taking some kind of cyber actions. And, I think a couple questions that any organization should ask themselves, right? Are you in Ukraine? You probably know that already, but for a lot of multinational companies, right? Thinking about, dare I say it, supply chain, right? What dependencies do you have? Do you have like any contractors in Ukraine or in that region, right? Thinking about how this could potentially affect you. U.S. government has put out a couple different warnings to critical infrastructure in the U.S., trying to anticipate in the event that a conflict ensued, how could those critical infrastructure sectors be affected? So I think threat modeling is so important here, right? Obviously, if you are in Ukraine, in that region, if you are critical infrastructure, potentially oil and gas in particular in the U.S., right, your preparations might look differently than other organizations. So I think thinking about threat modeling, thinking about your incident response playbook, great steps to take right now. Getting a +1 in terms of playbooks, right? Maybe not always exciting to practice your incident response procedures, but I do think that's a great action orgs can take right now. Other things to look at, right? There is some reporting coming out, right? Last month, we saw some defacements of Ukrainian government websites. Earlier this month, Microsoft and Unit 42 put out a pair of blog posts that I think are definitely worth looking at, right? As threat analysts, we can look at what different organizations are seeing from my take and what Unit 42 has put out, what Microsoft has put out. Right now, it does seem like a lot of this activity is primarily targeting organizations in Ukraine, right? Microsoft put out a report on a group they called Actinium. I think I'm saying that correctly. And talking about how that overlaps with a group others called Gamma Redan, which we're not going to get too much into the naming thing. I have a whole nother webcast on that. But my recommendation is use the name that the originators use, right? So activity here, the Microsoft describes Actinium. One recommendation, in addition to dusting off that incident response playbook, right? Taking a look at what TTPs groups like Actinium are using. I've called out Microsoft blog posts as being awesome in the past, right? The Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, they have some pretty amazing visibility and they have a lot of actionable content here, right? Talking about the initial access of phishing. But one thing I've pointed out before about Microsoft blog posts, and I would highlight, right? Scroll down, there's a lot of details here. They include indicators of compromise. My vote is whatever works for detection, use it. Right? Of course, there's a caveat here. Not always possible to determine what malicious component connects to what C2 infrastructure, right? You also need to realize that sometimes adversaries will move on from infrastructure very quickly. But still, hey, doesn't hurt to throw these into your SEM, whatever monitoring tools you have. Take a look at those. Other things, though, to highlight, all right? And you kind of have to scroll down. Don't just stop at the indicators, right? Indicators of compromise, we think of hashes, domains, etc. This is a scheduled task command line. This can also be awesome for detection. And if you scroll, right, there's so much actionable stuff here. And hats off to the Microsoft team, right? So much actionable info here. One thing I like to point out down here, sometimes people will overlook. They're like, oh, these are queries that you can put in Microsoft Office 365 or Microsoft 365 Defender. Pardon me. I'm working on my Microsoft product names. But okay, some of these are probably going to be specific to Microsoft products, but some of them, right, just looking for the domain whoint.info. That's something that anyone could do, right? This is probably Microsoft specific, but check out some of these down here. Suspicious MISHTA process execution. And I will stick to this. It's pronounced MISHTA. If you say MSHTA, that is okay. I say MISHTA. But take a look here, right? You don't need to have a Microsoft product to implement this analytic. File name's something like mishta.exe. Process command line has .dll roaming and contains roaming/j, right? You could try this out even if you're not using Microsoft products. Same thing here, suspicious scheduled task activities, right? How often is a scheduled task going to have create and W script and EVB script? Maybe you have one or two instances in your environment where that is happening, so tune those out. But right, I like to point out the fact that just because you don't have the products that any vendors are talking about in their blog posts doesn't mean there's nothing you can do here. So again, this Actinium blog post, I think a really good one to look at. And right, worst comes to worst, oh no, you just added some new behavioral analytics to your defenses that might help you catch Actinium or different groups as well. Yeah, absolutely, Sean. I promise I will share the URLs after the rundown. So don't worry. If you Google just Microsoft Actinium, you can find this one, but I'll share the URLs as well. So no worries about that. Cool. So other things to keep an eye out, right? Microsoft mentioned kindly in the intro of this blog post that the group they define as Actinium overlaps with another group called Gamma Redan. I should note, and my team has mentioned this, there's a worm called Gamma-Roo, no known relation to Gamma Redan. And if I'm saying Gamma Redan incorrectly, I'm sorry, potato. But a great blog post came out from Unit 42. Another team that I have a lot of respect for, right? They're also watching these geopolitical tensions like the rest of us. And they noted that they're seeing some separate activity from, right, the defacements that we talked about last month. Gamma Reading Group has been amping up their operations lately, though. So some history about this group. And then again, a lot of actionable details. Unit 42 sharing a bunch of different indicators they've seen from Gamma Reading Group. So also noting, hey, they observed an attempt to compromise a Western government entity in Ukraine. So again, that's where just because maybe you or your company isn't based in Ukraine, do you have any offices there? Governments around the world should probably be thinking about this right now. US government, I believe, closed their embassy in Kiev yesterday. So clearly the US government's thinking about this, and others should as well. But this is a really, really detailed report. One thing I really like is how they clustered out different sections of Gamma Reading infrastructure, right? This can be useful even if maybe you aren't totally sure what the relationship is. Clustering out, it's not just Gamma Reading, here are the different aspects of their activity. So this is another blog post. If, like many of us, you're sort of thinking like, what can we do right now? Actinium blog post, Gamma Reading blog post, Mandiant guide on preparing for destructive malware in case that's something that could happen. And then keeping an eye out, right? Keeping an eye on Twitter, talking to your colleagues in the same sector that you're in. Some folks commenting, tying this directly to Petya or not Petya, right? This is something we've heard of a lot. Not Petya, of course, that malware, ransomware, destructive malware, rather, that went worldwide a couple years ago. A lot of people are drawing comparisons to that because, right, it initially started in Ukraine and went worldwide. That said, I think that's the type of thing we should be looking out for as a community. I just haven't seen that yet, right? If you recall the Whispergate malware you talked about last month, doesn't seem like that was super widespread. So I think we should be looking for historical comparisons, right? In this kind of situation in the past, what has happened? That said, past historic activity isn't necessarily indicative of what's going to happen now. So I think, again, it sounds boring, but hey, if something like not Petya were to happen again, what would your organization do? Like what actions would you take? And I think that what I've settled on is that whenever there's any kind of tensions like this, geopolitical tension, something major happening in the world, it's really easy to get overwhelmed and think, hey, we have to start anew. This is a new thing. Maybe we'll see new malware, but the processes and procedures that your organization should follow, right, are likely going to be similar regardless of what the threats are. So, that's kind of all I have on Ukraine. I think that this is something that as analysts, again, we need to keep watching out for. As someone commented, like seeing infrastructure takedowns in Ukraine, that's probably an early sign of concern. And then from there, I think depends on your threat model, right? What kind of relationships do you have in Ukraine, software, subsidiaries, etc.? And then keeping an eye on, okay, is this going to be regional? Is it going to expand worldwide if there is activity that breaks out? So I would say, right, be prepared, but don't panic, right? Panic is never a useful part of incident response, in my opinion. But this is a case where absolutely, I think geopolitics can affect what we see in cyberspace. So keep an eye on that Ukraine situation. And sharing is caring, right? Thanks to Microsoft, Unit 42, many others who've shared what they're seeing, because I think that's how we're all going to kind of build each other up, right? As a community, keeping an eye out, sharing early what we see. All right, moving on from Ukraine. There's a lot happening in the world, so we can't just focus on one thing as always. I wanted to move on talking about annual report season. CrowdStrike just dropped their global threat report today, I believe. All right, shout out to them for the sweet graphics. Like, this is a pretty cool title page, in my opinion. This is annual report season, and as these annual reports drop, lots of different companies have them. Worth keeping an eye on. If you look at these and think about what are the key threats, right? The key trends that lots of organizations have seen in 2021 over the past year, chances are a lot of those are going to continue. And so what I love about these reports is that different organizations publish them, right? So CrowdStrike has theirs, my team's working on ours, Expel put theirs out, right? Many organizations, Mandiant has M-Trends, Verizon DBER will come out eventually. No one has perfect visibility. But taking a look at, okay, what does each company talk about, right? What from their visibility was important this past year? What do they think you should do about it? And honestly, if you read all of these reports and follow a lot of the recommendations, like your team is going to be much, much stronger as a result. So, a couple things to kind of call out in the CrowdStrike report. First off, I would just say, like anyone who's working on these reports, thank you. These things are a beast. Shout out to all of the amazing graphics teams who are supporting analysts who are writing these as well. Because if you've been through one of these writing these, you know it is not an easy thing, right? So one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is looking at different statistics. Everyone has different metrics they use, right? So pulling out things, we'll talk about ransomware in a bit. 82% increase in ransomware related data leaks, right? Based on CrowdStrike's visibility. 45% increase in interactive intrusion campaigns. So I think it's important to note that, right, everyone's visibility is different. So comparing that, hey, are other organizations seeing a similar increase, right? Of course, these numbers can be based on a lot of different things. Did CrowdStrike get new visibility, or different companies get new visibility? So other things to point out here, CrowdStrike debuted new animals. Their animals are how CrowdStrike identifies different actor groups, the wolf and the ocelot. Ocelot, tough one to spell there. So kind of a nice breakdown. This is helpful, right? All year long, if you're trying to figure out, okay, CrowdStrike put a report out on whatever kitten, remembering that's what they use for Iran. The breakout time is always an interesting one, right? An hour and 38 minutes. Time from initial compromise to moving to another host in the environment. And right, an hour 38 minutes depends on kind of how you look here. Like, is that a lot of time or a little time? This is a good one to kind of benchmark, right? If you are doing incident response or responding to intrusions, thinking about, okay, does it usually take us over or under an hour and 38 minutes? Can you get that down, right? That's one good outcome and maybe a useful metric. Hey, if you find usually it takes us a day to identify an intrusion, well, on average, right, based on CrowdStrike's visibility, adversaries, especially e-crime adversaries, might have already done lateral movement by that point. Can you try to get your response time down? That is a tough one. But the good news I would say about this is that that's the average, but not every adversary is going to move laterally within an hour and 38 minutes. So sometimes you're going to have more time. Hopefully, you will have more time. I'm getting some questions. This is being recorded. I should have said that up front. This is being recorded, so you can share with your friends afterwards. And I promise to share all the links as well. This is another interesting one, right? We talk about living off the land. It's sort of the buzzword where adversaries will use built-in tools on whatever operating system. And this is a useful breakdown, I think, in the CrowdStrike report. Malware-free intrusions versus using malware. So depends on how maybe they, denote, right, describe, define malware-free. But I think this would suggest a lot more living off the land happening, which if you think about why adversaries would do that, well, if I'm just using built-in tools, it's a lot harder for you to catch me, right? Sometimes. So other things, I like to point this out, and I've used this kind of similar graphic previously, right? Interactive intrusion activity over time. So this shows by kind of high-level buckets of threats, right? The red e-crime, the dark gray unattributed, the light blue hacktivist, and then the light gray up here at the top, targeted intrusions, which usually is what I think of as sort of state-sponsored, but really any kind of more targeted intrusion type. Key takeaway that I have again, and they've shared this graphic previously, is that don't ignore e-crime adversaries. I've talked about this quite a bit, but right, sometimes we just talked about Ukraine, and of course we're concerned about Russian state-sponsored actors, rightly so. But remember that a lot of intrusions are still conducted by e-crime actors, and so we can't ignore e-crime as a category. Again, really cool graphics. If you have the opportunity to work with graphic artists, I think that the best outcomes, like you could have a whole paragraph describing this, but conveying a lot of information in sort of a single graphic is pretty awesome. So those are their definition of targeted and those other categories. So a lot of awesome stuff in this report, right? Breaking down different intrusion types, looking at themes, right? You're probably going to see ransomware in most annual reports this year. But thinking about, okay, what themes did CrowdStrike highlight? What themes do other companies highlight? And probably the ones that a lot of companies highlight are ones that you should definitely be paying attention to. So again, CrowdStrike report, just an example of, right, the type of threat reporting, the annual threat reports that we're going to start seeing come out more and more now that we get into February, March timeframe. So as these come out, take a look at them. Think about, what are the trends here? How does that apply to my organization? Another one I wanted to highlight is from the team at Expel, and a hat tip for their punny title, Great Expeltations. I kind of like puns, even though I'm bad at them. This is where, right? Okay, ransomware. Ransomware is probably going to be in many people's threat report this year, but Expel highlighting business email compromise. And I really love this because this is one that I find a lot of analysts, including myself, sometimes will overlook a little bit, right? If you look at the losses from business email compromise, $1.8 billion in 2020 based on FBI metrics. Like, that's a lot of money lost. And if you're not familiar with business email compromise, this is basically where an adversary will just email someone and maybe develop a relationship, use social engineering, and try to trick them into wiring money. There's no malware, there's no lolbins. It's just social engineering and tricking a human. And I think as cybersecurity professionals, it's so easy for us to think about, right, tracking malware, tracking threat groups, but what about business email compromise, right? That requires us to kind of think a little bit beyond maybe where we're most comfortable. So business email compromise, really important trend. And I appreciate that this is one that Expel called out. And it's really interesting seeing, right, what are the different trends? They found 90% occurring within Office 365. That's interesting. Not a whole lot in Google Workspace. Why is that? Different hypotheses, right? But this, again, can give you information that maybe if you're debating between different platforms, maybe you find one versus the other is going to work better for you. This is one factor you might want to include. And I really like with the little umbrella icon down here, most organizations have some aspect of this in their annual report. How do you protect your organization, right? All of these recommendations. And honestly, you spend the time to go through and follow all these recommendations in all of the annual reports from these different companies, you're probably going to be in pretty darn good shape. So again, keep an eye out, right? CrowdStrike just dropped today their global threat report. Expel came out a few weeks ago. Many, many different vendors and companies will put these out. Worth keeping an eye on for the trends, because chances are, just because, right, 2021 ended, these threats and trends are going to probably continue into 2022. Excellent. Thank you, Jordan. I see you dropping all the links real time. I appreciate it. All right, I mentioned in most of these annual reports, you're going to see ransomware. So we have to talk about ransomware. Continues to be a threat. I've brought up their summaries before, but if you're trying to look for kind of an overview of the ransomware landscape, I find that the team at Coveware does an amazing job with their quarterly reports. Right? I mentioned with global, the annual reports, it's tough because everyone has different visibility. Coveware has great visibility on ransomware, and their analysts provide really useful analysis. Right? So Q4 2021, some different factors that have led Coveware to the assessment. Here are the reasons why we think maybe there's a little bit of a lull in ransomware right now. Right? Maybe some Biden administration actions, some legislation. Cyber insurance, this is something that I've heard quite a bit from different teams, right? Cyber insurance is sort of raising the bar a little bit, making it tougher to get claim reimbursement, making it tougher to get policies. So that could be another factor in this. Of course, the law enforcement actions, the arrests of our evil. different factors. And I think that they're wise here to say, well, it's not just one single thing. I think it's a conflation of different factors that could maybe be causing a little bit of a lull in ransomware in the past few months. That said, right, I also like that they don't just talk about right overall, but okay, the average ransomware amount rose in Q4. So that's kind of an interesting trend that maybe it's not as frequent, but if you get hit, adversaries are going to ask for more money. So Coveware, of course, one group I really like to watch for ransomware info. Also, of course, Alan Liska, the ransomware sommelier. He had a great Twitter thread, right? Again, we're all kind of people who are watching ransomware are thinking about, is there sort of a lull? And yes, looks like there is a lull, especially when we look at postings on those leak sites, right? Different ransomware groups have leak sites on the dark web where they post their victims. And of course, that's just one area of visibility. Like maybe they've decided they're not going to do that anymore. So we have to be cautious of that. But Alan pointed out a really, really great thing in this thread, right? Comparing things across years can be useful. Looking at last year, right? January 2021, he says, looks kind of similar, right? There's a similar dip in January 2022. And so Alan talks a little bit in this thread that there might be some seasonality, right? This also happens in August-ish timeframe, right? Sometimes there's a seasonality to threats for whatever reason, potentially a lull over the holidays in different regions of the world. And maybe if there's a lull in the initial access vectors that lead to ransomware, it kind of follows that there's a lull in ransomware operations as well. So thinking about, okay, maybe there's a seasonality to this as well. But Alan highlighting, right? February is probably going to surpass January. And just because there's a lull doesn't mean ransomware isn't awful still, right? Conti is still a pretty prevalent group right now. A lot of compromises from Conti. Another ransomware group that has gained notoriety over the weekend in particular, right? Anyone in the US in particular was watching the Super Bowl. The San Francisco 49ers were not in the Super Bowl. Maybe you were happy or devastated about that, depending on your favorite team, but came out that Blackbyte ransomware hit the San Francisco 49ers. This was just released over the weekend, I believe. So kind of an interesting timing. They were not in the Super Bowl, but hitting an NFL team around the Super Bowl time. A statement from the NFL confirmed that they were hit. And a couple of reports on Blackbyte that I wanted to point out. Blackbyte is a group that first kind of popped up in summer 2021. So if you haven't heard of them, right, that's nothing to be ashamed of. There are so many different ransomware groups. I can't keep track of all of them. The FBI and Secret Service put out this joint cybersecurity advisory, bunch of details about Blackbyte ransomware. So pointing out some kind of atomic indicators, IP addresses, right? These are things you can look for. Sometimes adversaries, these Blackbyte compromises will start with suspicious ASPX files. Sometimes those are web shells dropped. Ransom notes are always something you can look for. I would caution, though, that if you're detecting on ransom notes, might not be the most effective part of the chain to detect on. You ideally want to get before those ransom notes are written. And the good news is, right, FBI and Secret Service gave a bunch of details here. Hash values of suspicious files seen in Blackbyte intrusions. Maybe those are useful. Maybe they haven't been used again. Worth looking for. If they're not causing false positives, go for it. But I think I wanted to highlight to everyone, right, these observed commands. Don't overlook these. I know, talked about this with Actinium, right? It's easy to say, okay, hash value, domain name, IP, match on those. But these command lines are great detection opportunities. Realizing, right, it's tough sometimes for people to figure out, okay, what's unique here, right? Should I hit on every time there's an SC config? Is that unique in my data set? Got to call out, I don't always highlight my team's work, but my teammate Harrison wrote a blog post on Blackbyte back in November, right? Our team, in conjunction with one of our partners, saw a Blackbyte intrusion. And so one of the things that if you're sort of overwhelmed by the FBI reports, you're not really sure, you're not used to this behavioral detection thing, you might find this blog post to be helpful, right? We've talked about specific detection opportunities, right? Look for ASPX files written by this process. In terms of post-exploitation, right? Looking for different command line things. Very similar to what was in the FBI report here. We found this complex.exe file name that executing with a command line argument with a hash. Like maybe not normal in your environment. So if you're trying to, figure out, maybe we're concerned about black bite ransomware, a lot of different detection opportunities that you can look for here in this blog post. One I like to call out, this is sort of interesting. So there is a ransomware vaccine Florian Roth created called Raxine. I'm probably saying that wrong. But the idea here is, right, trying to prevent ransomware. That if you install this, maybe it would prevent some ransomware from happening. Well, the black bite operators tried to delete the scheduled task associated with Raxine. And why I find this so fascinating is that the adversaries knew that Raxine exists, that defenders are trying to bypass, right? Bypass and prevent ransomware, and they know that, and then they're trying to disable that Raxine tool. So kind of an interesting technique that these operators use. Another one to call out, this is sort of an interesting one. You might have seen this, I think it happened with eGregor or other ransomware groups, right? A year or so ago. It's a technique called print bombing. So I think there's a video circulating of like a printer spitting out a bunch of ransom notes being printed. Well, luckily this technique has somewhat of a predictable command line in some cases. So again, ideally, you probably want to try to detect this compromise before the ransom notes are printed, but that's another detection opportunity. So again, just a couple things to point out, right? Don't overlook the behaviors, the command lines, because those can be useful as well. But as always with ransomware, right, try to stop it before it gets to the printing of ransom notes. And right, that's where we'll talk in a little bit about some of the crimeware that's been prevalent lately. One family to keep an eye out for with Blackbite is Dridex, right? We don't know for sure, but Dridex, I could be remembering this wrong. I think Dridex is one that is associated with definitely ransomware, might not be Blackbite. So regardless, always good to keep an eye on crimeware, or in this case, Blackbite gained an access by exploiting one of those proxy shell vulnerabilities. And so if you still haven't patched, if you're still vulnerable to proxy shell, another reason to patch and update. All right, let's see what else we've got for ransomware. Some good ransomware news here. MCSoft, I think I've said their name wrong in the past, and I'm really, really sorry to folks who work there. I've said it incorrectly. But these folks often will release decryptors. And so they recently released a decryptor for Maze, Sekhmet, and eGregor ransomware. I will say that I think a lot of those groups aren't as active lately. But heck, if you had an intrusion by any of those operators in the past, try this out. See if you can get some of your encrypted files back. So really cool that MCSoft released that to the community. Some good news. Also kind of in rounding up ransomware reporting, recent joint report between the US government, the Australian government, and the UK government, which is kind of cool, about ransomware trends in 2021, right? So another global or annual report, rather, this one from governments. And a lot of this is probably not too surprising to those who have been watching ransomware, but still worth seeing, okay, compared to government visibility versus private sector, seeing the same kind of things. Initial access often happens via phishing, RDP brute forcing, or exploiting software vulnerabilities, right? Those remain the top 3 initial access techniques, and I've heard this across public and private sector. So please, please, RDP, if it's accessible to the internet, use multi-factor authentication, patch your software, right? These are things we've talked about over and over, but good to see from multiple different governments, the same kind of recommendations. All right, I think that's all the key things I had to talk about with ransomware. Even though there's a lull, still worth watching ransomware, as always. A grab bag of a couple other things. Good news from Microsoft. You all might have seen this, right? By default, some versions of Office are blocking macros from the internet by default. And I know myself and many other cybersecurity professionals are cheering about this, right? We know that so many different malware families try to gain that initial access. They rely on users to enable macros. And so this is a really great change from Microsoft. I realize that some folks were like, man, it's about time. I would say, right? And if you saw some tweets from folks at Microsoft, realizing that Microsoft has a lot of customers and making a change like this isn't easy at that scale, right? So hats off to everyone at Microsoft who kind of presented the evidence that, hey, this is going to significantly protect a lot of users and trying to think through all the stuff that none of us want to have to think through. Like, what could be the negative consequences, right? Are there accountants who legitimately use macros who might be affected by this? And how do we respond to them? So, right, you might say, about time. Making this kind of change at scale is really tough. So I'm really excited to see it. Important to note that it's only certain versions right now, but sounds like they're trying to push that out. So great news there. Because of course, as we know, lots of different threats love macros. Pointing out one of those many threats, Qbot. This is a great post from the DFIR report, and I just love the title as well. Qbot likes to move it. I'm not going to sing for you. But another great post from the folks at DFIR report. Again, just talking about the Qbot intrusion chain, as they so often do, starting with those Excel hidden version 4 macros. So as always, really, really love their graphics in the DFIR report. Again, hitting this theme that they're moving pretty quickly here. But again, looking for weird scheduled tasks, register 32, all of our living off the land binaries, great opportunities to catch these chains as they go. Another awesome report from the DFIR report I wanted to highlight. They had a Defender's Guide to Cobalt Strike Part 1, and then Part 2 came out at the end of January. So Cobalt Strike, I found, is one of those sources or one of those tools that like red teamers really understand, but sometimes, right, Intel analysts are like, I don't know, it's kind of mysterious and I don't really understand what it's doing. This is a really great one from the DFIR report, breaking down the different functionality of Cobalt Strike. And I think this meme kind of summarizes it really well. If you can dodge Cobalt Strike, you can dodge a lot of ransomware, a lot of APT state-sponsored groups as well. So shout out to them. This is one, it's a meaty read, but definitely worth your time to understand what's Cobalt Strike doing and how can defenders identify it. A couple other grab bag items I wanted to hit. Emotet, right? Emotet has been back for a little bit now, and they are continuing to, change things up. I think they've been quiet for a few days. I haven't checked in the last hour, though. But I would highly recommend, keeping an eye on Emotet. We talked about ransomware. There's a lot of assessments out there that Emotet has led to Cobalt Strike. That we know is sort of a classic pre-ransomware behavior. So a lot of concern that potentially an Emotet plus Cobalt Strike pattern could lead to ransomware like Conti. I think we're still kind of waiting for public confirmation if anyone's seen that, but worth keeping an eye out. Best recommendation for tracking Emotet, follow Cryptolamus, right? Follow people on Twitter, including Cryptolamus. These researchers have relentlessly tracked Emotet. And so either they're going to tweet about it themselves or retweet others who are tracking it. I believe the main kind of categories right now of Emotet that researchers are seeing are Epoch 4 and Epoch 5 that have slightly different characteristics. It's all not great, though, and a lot of it, as researchers have noted, have led to Cobalt Strike. Sebastian asking a great question. Is there a way to ingest these reports automatically, centralize them somehow? Yes, the classic challenge of how do we handle all of this reporting? I have not found a magic solution, right? That said, some threat intelligence platforms, I believe MISP does have functionality to kind of ingest reporting, especially if you ingest something from like Alien Vault OTX that has indicators structured. The reality is, though, I've found there's no magic solution. Having some kind of RSS feed is a great practice. There are different tools. Feedly has a free version. You kind of find the RSS feed that works for you. I would recommend adding a lot of the sources that I highlighted as high value sources. Microsoft, Unit 42, the DFIR report, Red Canary, Sentinel-1, CrowdStrike, Mandiant, right? Expel, all of these vendors, all of these organizations and researchers who put out good reporting, add them to an RSS feed. I would recommend also following different folks on Twitter, right? You can use Twitter lists. Maybe you create a list for Emotet, and you add Cryptolemus, and you add Max, and you add folks like Brad Duncan or James WT. Or maybe you just have a list in Twitter for malware researchers. That's a great resource as well. You can also, using a tool like TweetDeck, you can follow different hashtags, right? Hashtag QBot or QuackBot or hashtag Emotet. The reality is, though, regardless of the approach you choose, it is going to be some work. Absolutely. And I would say other resources, my friend Micah, who runs OSINT Curious, has a lot of great tips on doing this kind of aggregation. So I think there are tools that can absolutely help you do the aggregation. But the reality is, most of the time, analysts are going to have to look through this stuff and decide if it's actionable for you and your organization. So not an easy task for any of us, keeping track of all of this. The other recommendation I have is to look at different summaries. So for example, SANS News Bites, right, has a weekly summary of like key reporting. There's a really good one from Binary Defense. Other organizations, Digital Shadows, I believe, still has a weekly OSINT summary. So sometimes if you look at what other people are summarizing, right, then maybe you don't have to do all the work yourself. That said, as you can probably tell, this could be a full-time job for like multiple analysts. So take advantage of what other people share, any kind of summaries. That can be a good way to get started as well. One last report I wanted to highlight from Sentinel-1. And I wanted to highlight this because this is a region of the world that often doesn't get quite as much attention, right? This is an actor that they identified called Modified Elephant. I always love a good threat group name, and I think this is an elegant one. I like it. Targeting a lot of victims in India, which again, right, not something we always hear about, but important depending on where you have a regional footprint in the world. This might be a group that you should watch out for. There's a really, really detailed report on this, but one thing I wanted to also call out that I really like about this report, a lot of details, really beautiful timeline. Towards the end, they talk about relations to other threat clusters. And I hit on this a little bit, right? I have a whole nother webcast where I talk about group naming. But I think a best practice for anyone who's putting out reportings is noting any overlaps with names that other researchers use, right? Unit 42 did this. Microsoft did this, saying, hey, we call this actinium overlaps closely with gamma-redin. So I really liked this summary in this Modified Elephant report from Sentinel-1, talking about what have other organizations seen that might be related, calling out, right, Amnesty International reporting. Kind of cool, calling out another report, Operation Hangover. And so I think this is a great practice. Just because your team didn't identify some activity, right, doesn't mean you can't link to it. I think it really strengthens a report saying, hey, here's how we define Modified Elephant, and here's some things that other people in the community have seen as well that overlap. So another great report on a region of the world that maybe doesn't get as much attention as perhaps it should. Again, coming back to, depends on your threat model. If you have a footprint in India, this might be a good one to look at as well. All right, with that, that is all I have for you today. All right, a lot of things to hit. So I guess key takeaways, I'd say, keep an eye on what's going on in Ukraine. right? I firmly believe folks around the world are watching cyberspace, watching to see what happens there. If you see something, right, share with others. We're in this together, right? If there is global effects from a regional conflict, I truly believe that different analysts around the world, we're going to help each other out. Try to prepare as much as you can, dust off that incident response playbook, keep an eye on what's happening. Don't overlook everything else though, right? Ransomware, though there's a lull, Conti is coming on strong, Lockbit 2.0, Blackbyte, don't overlook that. And of course, don't overlook those families like Qbot, like Emotet that so often lead to ransomware later. So a lot of things, as always, to keep an eye on. As we're closing, just a couple notes on the SANS side, right? SANS CTI Summit was a couple weeks ago. Those videos should come out at some point. I'll share them when they do. So much great content there. We also have the SANS DFIR Summit coming up in August. So keep an eye out. This is the 15th year of that summit. It's another awesome summit. And so more info will be coming out. The call for proposals will be coming out pretty soon. So if you're a DFIR-minded person, keep an eye out for that and think about submitting your great idea. Right? If you ever hesitate, just throw your idea in there. You never know what's going to be useful to others that maybe a new idea. So even if you never presented, keep an eye out. Think about submitting to the DFIR Summit. So that CFP will be coming out soon. With that, I forgot to wish everyone a belated Valentine's Day. I hope you got to spend time with those that you loved yesterday. A lot to handle, a lot to watch as always. But thank you all so much for tuning in. And until next month, stay well and good luck.